Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Hello? Good evening, everyone. I'm Paige Sifford-Bellata, Director of Advancement and Community Relations here at Bexley Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to part 2 of tonight's celebration. And also, the first of our visits of our author series, our Centennial author series. Tonight's event would not have been possible without the generous support of our benefactor and lead sponsors, Annie and Tim Bezapachenko, Beth Crane and Richard McKee, Crane Group, Friends of Bexley Public Library, Giuseppe Ritrovo, Linda and Frank Cass, the Teagle Foundation, and the Whitehall Bexley Rotary Foundation. We are especially grateful that with their support, and in addition to others, that all these amazing authors and poets that we're featuring throughout this year are going to be completely free of charge to our community. If you have an interest in bringing brilliant authors and artists to our community, there's still plenty of time. Please let us know. The Centennial Author Series Fund at Bexley Community Foundation is still taking donations. Of course, our library also relies heavily on the support of our many community partners and others who are graciously helping us celebrate literacy and learning in Bexley. To name just a few, Bexley Bed and Breakfast, Bexley City Schools, Bexley Community Foundation, Bexley Magazine, Bexley Pizza Plus, Christopher Keel's Photography, Gramercy Books, Johnson's Real Ice Cream, Seventh Sun Brewery, and Stoltz Mead Global. I'd like to give a big thanks to the Book Loft for being here tonight to sell Mr. Montás's books. If you have not already, please visit them out in the hallway just up off the auditorium to purchase a copy for the book signing following tonight's event. Lastly, I'd like to recognize and thank the hard work and support of our host committee chairs, Annie and Tim Bezapachenko. They have been great champions of this year's Centennial Author Series, and they exemplify a commitment to lifelong learning in our community. In fact, it was really Annie that helped put the wheels in motion for tonight's author to be with us. And with that in mind, we asked Annie to do the honors of introducing tonight's distinguished author and scholar, Roosevelt Montás.
Good evening. I thought Ben was going to have us all sing happy birthday up there, so I'm glad he spared us. I wouldn't put it past him. I'm Annie Bezapachenko, and I'm pleased not only to be the co-chair of this year's Centennial Author Series with my husband, Tim, but also to be able to introduce you to our first guest author of the series, Roosevelt Montás. Roosevelt will share some of his thoughts and insights with us for about 20 minutes this evening, after which he will be in conversation with the Bexley Public Library Director, Ben Heckman. Then we'll have a brief Q&A session that will be offered at the end. Roosevelt Montás is Senior Lecturer in American Studies and English at Columbia University and the former director of Columbia Center for the Core Curriculum from 2008 to 2018. He was born in the Dominican Republic and moved to New York as a teenager, where he attended public schools in Queens before entering Columbia College in 1991. In 2003, he completed a PhD in English, also at Columbia, and then his dissertation, Rethinking America, won Columbia University's 2004 Bancroft Award. In 2000, he received the Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching by a graduate student And in 2008, he received the Dominican Republic's National Youth Prize. He regularly teaches moral and political philosophy in the Columbia core curriculum, as well as seminars in American Studies. He is also the director of the Center of American Studies' Freedom and Citizenship program, which brings low-income high school students to the Columbia campus to study college-level work in the humanities, and then helps them prepare successful applications for college. His recent book, Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation, details the experiences of Montás as a student and a teacher, telling the story of how the great books transformed his life and why they have the power to speak to people from all backgrounds. I first got to know Roosevelt almost 15 years ago through my work at the Teagle Foundation, where he was instrumental in helping to establish the Freedom and Citizenship program at Columbia University. I am consistently and continually struck by the way he connects with his students and impressed by his ability to help young people in search of answers for some of their biggest, most complicated questions. Roosevelt is a brilliant teacher, scholar, and humanist. He's also a very kind and thoughtful human being, and I'm honored to call him my friend. Please join me on behalf of the Bexley Public Library Centennial Author Series in welcoming Roosevelt Montás to our community.
Thank you, Annie, for such a warm introduction. I also feel gratitude for your friendship, in addition to your, would that be colleagueship? Is that a thing? Collegiality, being a colleague. And I am so honored to be here at the Bexley Public Library and to be the inaugural speaker in your Centennial celebration. Really, what an amazing, extraordinary thing it is for a library to be 100 years in a community, to have been central to the whole development of this community. So it's a big honor for me to be here. I'll talk a little bit about this book I wrote, looking at my watch, because I have this disease that professors can get, which is, so I will try to be mindful of the time. I read up a little bit about the history of Bexley and was struck by this fact that 100 years ago, or just a little over 100 years ago, citizens of the community supported the creation of this library, and then not long after it was established, I understand it used to be at the what was then the local high school. Then they issued a bond to finance the construction of this building. The community did, the voters did. People voted to spend money as a community to build a gorgeous building like this to house an extraordinary institution like a library. And that just made me think about how do we foster the type of citizen and the type of community that makes that kind of commitment and that makes that kind of investment. Somehow it's a little hard for us to see examples of that kind of civic mindedness, of building an institution and building a building that is meant to last hundreds of years. Right? This is the first centennial of this institution. What kind of education, what kind of context, what kind of social cultivation do we need to create the kind of citizen and the kind of community that would make that kind of far-reaching investment in the social infrastructure of our society. And that idea, or that question that thinking about this library made me pose, connects precisely to the thing that this book is about, which is liberal education, because a kind of education that produces that kind of individual and that kind of community is a form of education that we call liberal. A liberal education is, at its most basic level, an education for a life of freedom. That word, that liberal education, today, it's often misunderstood, right? Because the word liberal, in our political context, means something, right? It means left of center. It means Democrats and left from there, ending up somewhere with communists, right? That's liberal. And on the other side, you have conservatives. So often, when people hear liberal education, just that word immediately closes off. Gates are down. It is not for me. It's not my kind of thing. And it doesn't help that universities today are, in fact, dominated by sort of political liberalism. Most faculty, most students, there are exceptions, obviously. So that sort of overlays that association that a liberal education is a kind of education for left, granola eating, elite types. And that's unfortunate, because that's not what liberal education means. That's not what it is. The word liberal in liberal education, that term, liberal education, has been used for hundreds and hundreds of years, long before the United States was a country. That a kind of education that has been described as liberal education. And that kind of education was conceived of, in fact, in ancient Athens. So about 2,500 years ago, 2 millennia and a half. And it was conceived in Athens, which was a democracy. Athens was sort of one of the earliest fully functioning democracies. And like all ancient democracies, what they meant when they established a democracy was direct democracy. That is, we have something that's not a direct democracy, and that they wouldn't have called a democracy in antiquity. We have a representative democracy, right? We vote for representatives who then become the actual lawmakers and the executives and the political officers. We don't do that directly. Well, in antiquity, democracy was a direct democracy. Every citizen of a democracy voted on laws directly, held political office. They did it by lot. It was your turn to be, treasurer or whatever. It's your turn to be a sanitation commissioner. They served on juries. They served in the army. Now, those were the citizens of the democracy. Athens, like democracies tend to be, was a slave democracy. And there's a lesson there for us in the history of democracy. The democracies were always slave democracy. Even our own was a slave democracy. And the sort of extraordinary thing about America was the attempt to have democracy without slavery. An attempt, of course, that begins in 1863, not in 1776, although that impulse towards universal freedom is very much there in 1776, which is what made slavery ultimately incompatible with the fundamental idea of the nation. But anyway, in ancient Athens, a slave society that's a direct democracy, the question emerged, what kind of education will prepare an Athenian citizen to fulfill the tasks, the roles, the duties of citizenship? That is, how do we prepare this person to be a member of the self-governing community? How do we prepare this person to make decisions about laws, to make decisions in juries, to make decisions about military preparations, to make decisions about warfare, when do we go to war and how do we fight it, to make decisions about the economy, about trade, to make decisions about religious practices. What kind of education do we need to instill in a person to equip them for this task of collective self-governance? Now, you can see right away that a person that's going to be prepared to be a governor, that is to participate in governing a society, is going to need to understand something about history, and about human psychology, and about religion, and about science, and about the economy, and about philosophy, and about theology, and about the weather, and about trade. In fact, there is no area of human endeavor in which a person who is going to participate in collective self-governance does not need some kind of competence in. That kind of education that would prepare this individual for the task of self-governance, they called liberal education, because it was education for the free, right? For the people who had liberty. It was an education for free people. To this day, when we think about liberal education, we are thinking about a kind of education that is appropriate for the free human being. Now, in ancient Athens, that was contrasted with slave education. In our society, it is contrasted with technical education or vocational education or professional education. When you go to medical school, you are trained in this very specific knowledge base and practice base to be a physician, right? That's not liberal education. It is particular, applied, specialized education. Liberal education is the kind of education that pertains and is relevant to the doctor, to the physician, as much as it is to the computer scientist, to the lawyer, to the entertainer. It is the base, bottom level kind of education that teaches you how to be a citizen in a self-governing community. That's why you can't have a democracy without liberal education. That is, you cannot produce the agents, the individuals that will participate in this collective self-governance, which is what democracy means, without an education that is intentional and self-consciously aimed at preparing an individual for that task. Now, there are two dimensions to that task of self-governance. One is collective, and I'll come back to collective in a minute, but I want to highlight that there's another aspect of self-governance, which is just individual. How do I manage my own freedom? How do I govern myself? How do I organize my life in a way that most fully fulfills my human capacities? If you think of a plant, the way that you take care of a plant is by providing it with the basic things it needs to fully flower and become itself, right? The right amount of moisture, the right soil, the right amount of light. And that's some version of those three things is essentially what you need: the right soil, the right moisture, the right amount of light. And then this thing just flowers. And the more fully itself, the more fully it can manifest and develop, unfold its inner capacities, the healthier, the better, the more excellent the plant it is. Same thing happens for humans. That when we are in a context in which we develop most fully our inner human capacities, we are the most excellent version of ourselves. A liberal education is to equip us for that individual full realization and development. Each one of us, because we are free, that is, we require liberal education because we're in this condition where we have to self-govern. Each one of us has to posit for ourselves some notion of the human good, some notion of what constitutes the best kind of life for me to live. You can't escape that. Each one of you has to conceive for yourself what is the best kind of life that I can live and then pursue it. And no one can do it for you. You have to do that yourself. What does it take for you to be able to posit for yourself the notion of a good life? What kinds of values, what kinds of understanding, what kinds of insight, what kind of self-knowledge, what kind of orientation towards yourself, what kind of individual development is most conducive to you using that freedom to posit for yourself what kind of life is most worth living. How do we equip you to best use that freedom? Liberal education, education for freedom. That's the personal. Then there's the collective. What do you need to be an effective, maximally capable member of a self-governing community, of a democracy? You're going to need broad knowledge of human psychology, of basic things like the economy, skills to be able to differentiate disinformation from information, a kind of sophistication and skepticism that makes you not gullible, not easily fooled and deceived. You need a capacity to articulate your ideas. You need a capacity to discern what other people are saying, to listen. A whole set of civic virtues. You need to have values, that the kind of value that would motivate a community to invest in something like this library, right? A kind of vision of society like that. Again, that's liberal education at the collective level. In the few minutes before I call Ben up here to pursue the conversation, let me tell you a little bit about this book I wrote. The book has three, you might say, strands, three threads, and they're kind of interwoven together. One thread is biographical. I tell some of the story of my own life and of my own education. Because of the sort of idiosyncratic character of my own story, the impact of liberal education is very obvious, it's very visible. I grew up in the Dominican Republic, in a little mountain town, with that, sometimes I say it was like growing up in the 19th century, because I didn't have TV, I didn't have a refrigerator, a stove, a telephone. It was really in quite a different world, and a world that was agrarian, it was rural, rooted in a kind of really different way of living. It wasn't that much of a money economy, it was more like an exchange economy. It was very low schooling. My dad was 4th grade, was the last grade he completed. My mom went a little further than that, but never finished high school. And then when I was 12 years old, I came to the United States with my mother. My mother had arrived a few years earlier and then brought my brother and I. My brother was 17, I was 12. My mother didn't speak English, had a minimum wage job in a factory. We, of course, didn't speak English or anything. She lost her job. Shortly after we arrived, we couldn't pay the rent. My brother and I ended up living in a basement room of a distant relative while mom fared for herself. We went to the local public school. Very marginal, on the edge, rough, disempowered condition. And through a series of fortunate events, and which I detailed in the book, I ended up going to an Ivy League university for college and getting really one of the best kind of education that money can buy in the entire world. Here's a poor kid, I had no money, we were on welfare, who lands in this situation. And that's why our mother brought us to America, because she understood that we would have opportunities in America that we would never have in the Dominican Republic. And that's Exhibit A, is that I had that privilege of getting a kind of education that really is very expensive and usually only accessible to the highly privileged and highly resourced in our society. And at Columbia, it so happens that Columbia has this thing called the core curriculum, which is a great books program. So every first-year student at Columbia is reading the Iliad and the Odyssey and Herodotus and Thucydides and Sophocles and Shakespeare and Don Quixote and Dante and Montaigne. It's this incredibly philosophically and literary intense curriculum. And it changed my life. And so I tell the story of some of the most significant encounters I had with books, how they helped me make sense of my own experience, the dislocations, the discontinuities, the ruptures, being a poor kid who hardly, whose English was barely good enough to do college in an Ivy League university. So that's one strand of the book, autobiographical. Another strand is a discussion of 4 writers, 4 texts, that had a particularly pronounced, significant impact in my development, and with which I have lived for 30 years now, and a good portion of those teaching those books now to undergraduates. The first of those books is St. Augustine's extraordinary autobiography called Confessions, The Confessions of St. Augustine, which I read as a first-year student at Columbia. The second text I discuss is a couple of dialogues of Plato that record the last days of his teacher Socrates and his execution. And the third writer I discuss is Sigmund Freud and the practice of psychoanalysis and sort of the tools for self-exploration and model for understanding the human mind that come into circulation through Freud's work. And the last writer I discuss is Mahatma Gandhi, the great Indian spiritual, political leader, who is a figure who understands the Western tradition, is educated in England as a lawyer, he reads all the books that I read and that helped shape me, he read them too, but he comes at them from an entirely different tradition. So it opens up this whole other world to all the questions that I'm used to dealing with in the Western tradition. That's the third strand of the book, a discussion of each of these writers, and in a way that is sort of accessible, and that if you've never read Augustine or Freud or Gandhi, it'll give you a sense of what is it about these writers that makes them worth reading, not for an academic or a scholar, but for a regular person. The last strand of the book has to do with American higher education and about the place of this form of education that I call liberal around the and future of that kind of education in America. As you might guess, it is a form of education that is under siege, that has been systematically dismantled over the last 50 years, and it's much rarer than it used to be. There's a bit of a renaissance happening right now, and this book is part of a sort of broader intellectual reconnection with that idea of education. But it's that third strand of the book is a critique of American higher education and an examination of the place of the humanities today. So these 3 things, the autobiographical, the discussion of those writers, the reflections on American higher education, are kind of interwoven to make that book what it is. And I hope that some of you read it and that it's meaningful to you. It's a book in which I poured my entire heart into that book. Thank you.
All right. That was a great introduction. It knocked out 4 or 5 of my questions. I want to say first, I said this to you when I picked you up from the airport. I was going to tell the story. I find this to be very serendipitous because Annie Bezbachenko reached out to us, said, I want to get involved in the library. I said, great. And so we picked some arbitrary date. And Monday night, new books go out Tuesday. So Monday night, there's a cart of new books. So I walk by and I see, Rescuing Socrates. Someone who's had a liberal education and feels the impact of what you've just talked about. I said, yeah, we need this. And I started looking at it and I read some of it. So then the next morning we met Annie at the coffee shop across the street, and she started about, I just read this book before it even came out. See, that's one of the things that librarians get.
The librarian's privilege.
That's right. So the fact that you're now here, and I think it's so appropriate that we're, the People's University, where hopefully you have a solid foundation of the liberal education that you can continue as you go through life at the library. I think it's appropriate, and I'm so wonderful to have you here. And I loved your book. I think the way you talked about, I read a little bit of Freud. I didn't really have much of Gandhi at all, and the way that he presents each chapter is really understandable and definitely worth a read. So jumping to question 4. Who was on the bubble? If you had to write a 5th chapter, who would be your 5th philosopher or thinker that you would say had an impact?
Yeah.
I'm a librarian, man. You knew it was going to be,
Yeah, I'm gonna give you 2. I'm gonna give you 5 and 6.
We'll take it.
And here's the thing, my wife and chief consultant in all matters said, you're writing about 4 guys, right? And 3 of them white guys. And of course, all of them dead. Yes, it is just 4 white guys, and the 5th one is also a dead white guy. The 5th one would be Karl Marx. Huge, seminal thinker in social science. Marx, of course, is most known in the non-academic world for being sort of the theorist of communism and the political figure in the name of whose philosophy communist regimes like China and the former Soviet Union say, we're Marxist states. They're, of course, not Marxist states. And if you read Marx, you realize that they're not Marxist states, nor is Cuba or North Korea. But Marx is sort of, as a political thinker and as an economic thinker, sort of failed. Like the political system he theorized didn't work. But as a social scientist, Marx is incredibly influential in giving us a way to think about society. So I'll give you an example of this. Marx says conflicts between nations are ultimately always about resources. The economic interests are always at bottom of conflicts. Now, people will not talk about it in that way. They say they're fighting for freedom, or they're fighting for their land, or they're fighting for country, or they're fighting against an invader. The terms in which people argue the conflict, Marx says, it's always ideological. It's about ideas. But if you ignore what they say and just look at the movement of capital and look at the objective, empirical distribution of what he calls capital, that gives you, it's like an X-ray vision. And that turns out to be incredibly, incredibly powerful. So for example, you look at the American Revolution, where it's about freedom, it's about individual rights. Well, if you do a deeper analysis, you realize that there are economic interests at that moment, taxation, trade, who the leaders are. But some of the leaders might be fighting for economic reasons, others might be fighting for ideological reasons, but Marx says at bottom, it's an economic reality. Take the Civil War, right? Huge ideological war, slavery. Well, but slavery is also an economic reality. And without the economic conditions lining up just right, you don't get the Civil War. It is about slavery, but slavery is an economic system too. And it is when the economic forces of production come into conflict with each other that creates the conditions for that thing, both the American Revolution and the Civil War to happen. But take any war, take the Second World War or the First World War, take the French Revolution. Marx gives you this paradigm that actually is extraordinarily powerful in understanding not just conflicts, which is international conflicts, which is the example I've given you, but art, literature, politics, philosophy. It's this extraordinarily powerful paradigm. So anyway, Marx would be a 5th writer that whose thinking was so seminal, was so kind of, it like lit up my brain in this very influential way. The sixth would be Virginia Woolf, and okay, now there's a woman.
She's upstairs on the show.
Oh, okay. And you know, I studied comparative literature as an undergraduate, and my PhD is in English, so I read and teach a lot of literature. And I could write another book just talking about literary texts, because so much of the way I think about humanity and my own existential condition has been fueled, has been nourished by literature, by fiction. Virginia Woolf, and she's an extraordinary writer. If you're not familiar with Virginia Woolf, I can't recommend enough her novels. You take something like To the Lighthouse, and they're novels in which they're not plot driven. It's not like, you know, a lot of stuff happens. But what you get is this very fine-tuned and penetrating, deep penetration of the human condition, of what it's like to be human. Woolf, like other great novelists, but Woolf is really special in her capacity to sort of shine a light into corners of your own mental experience that are there, but that you may not have been seeing before. Reading Virginia Woolf is like going with a flashlight into the recesses of your human experience and illuminating them. And it had that impact for me, not the first time I read it, interestingly, but the second time I read this one particular book, To the Lighthouse, which was in the core curriculum.
That's great. I think that sounds like a great library program. You could come and talk about literary works and how they impact your life. Talking about the human endeavor of this, you write here on page 84, for anybody that's paying attention, a teacher in the humanities can give students no greater gift than the revelation of the self as the primary object of lifelong investigation, the habit of seeing their ordinary human experience with critical self-awareness. And then you talk about how it demands the most difficult and most decisive psychic tasks to look unflinchingly at yourself. So I've read the book twice, and the first time I wrote in the side here, in the age of total distraction, ? I imagine looking at yourself, constantly trying to understand yourself better and improve is hard and uncomfortable from the get-go.
Yeah.
From any work that I've done. Not as deep as yours, read the book. When you're teaching students, I can be distracted and not even have to think about myself or engage, or I just can constantly respond. Do you see that in the classroom with the students, that this is a harder task for some of them?
Absolutely. I see it with the students that it is a harder task for them to hold their gaze steady on any object. And it's especially hard to hold the gaze steady on themselves. I see it in my students, I see it in myself. The world in which we live is so full of compelling distractions. And not only, and I don't say distractions just in a frivolous way, like, you know, watching TikTok 10-second videos of kitty cats or whatever you like, people falling down or people punching each other, whatever you like. I mean, there are very rich and enriching and worthwhile distractions, you know, movies, art, science, knowledge, political news, political analysis, social analysis. You could spend your entire waking hour just enriching yourself in this kind of deeply nutritious way, in a way that was impossible before. But the degree of distraction for us and for young people today is something completely unprecedented. And part of what a liberal college education does today, which wasn't as necessary before, but now it is one of the few places where a student gets to do this, is precisely to train this attention muscle, to train this reflective and introspective muscle through the act of reading and through the act of contemplation of important, significant ideas. One example I often use is about Shakespeare, right? If you want to understand Macbeth, the most important thing, the thing that will give you the deepest insight and appreciation into Macbeth is not reading a lot of scholarship about Macbeth, is looking into yourself and understanding the nature of ambition. What is it like to be in the grip of blinding ambition? What is it like to suffer unassuageable guilt, the kind of guilt that you can't wash away? What is that human experience like? What is the experience of betrayal? And to the extent that you look into yourself and get a deeper understanding of those human conditions, that gives you the insight into Macbeth and into Shakespeare, right? So reading literature especially is like looking into a mirror in a way. Literature provides a pathway into self-exploration. It's the only way that literature becomes rich and meaningful, is by a kind of inner deep dive. So it's why it's so important today that we keep serious reading and a lot of reading at the center of the undergraduate curriculum.
I told you I wasn't going to share a lot of personal anecdotes on this, but I'm going to, if I may.
Please.
I picked up Aeschylus one time, and I read a passage, and it, from 800 years ago, connected, is that right? Am I doing that right?
About 2,000.
2,000 years ago, thank you. I went under in case I was wrong. He describes waiting on a wall for the light to know, and I was waiting for a medical diagnosis to come to make sure, to tell me that it was clear, that I was through it.
A light.
Yes. And the way he describes him waiting, like I brought it, I thought I'd read it, but I won't do that. He wrote this 2,000 years ago, and it connected with me in a way that nothing else had. And it brings you that perspective. I think the great books bring you that perspective of others have been there 2,000 years ago. So this isn't just you and I sharing an experience, but all the big questions are all still the same big questions. All the issues are still the same big issues from 2,000 years ago, 800 years ago, today. So I just want to share that too. As the literature holds up the mirror, I think it can also build connection and understanding that this isn't new for us.
This is what makes a great book great, is its capacity to illuminate the commonality of human experience, right? That you can have, that Aeschylus, writing 2 millennia ago, can say something that feels to you alive and vivid and utterly relevant to your experience today in an entirely different world. I'll give you one other example that is not my own. I heard somebody else point this out, but it has stuck with me, which is the Iliad, which is even older. The Iliad might be closer to 3,000 years, one of the earliest texts that we have, a narrative text. It's an epic poem. But there is a scene in the Iliad in which the god Apollo, Iliad is a war between the Trojans and the Greeks, and the two armies are fighting, and the god Apollo joins the army, takes on human form. So of course, it's like the best fighter. He's just decimating the army. And Homer, as he often does, goes into an extended metaphor. And he says, just like children on the beach build sandcastles and then take delight in trampling over them, in the same way, Apollo was trampling and destroying and taking pleasure in doing that of the army. And what this person pointed out is like they read this in a class and suddenly they had this realization that little kids 3,000 years ago in the shores of the Aegean Sea used to do the exact same thing that like my 6-year-old does on the shores of Lake Michigan on the Jersey Shore, which is like build the sandcastles and then just take this delight in going to trampoline. That kids back then in this other entirely different world than kids today and kids like who I was are in some fundamental way the same. And oh my God, that is just so powerful.
Yeah. Taking a different way and speaking about academics, you wrote this for some part of the audience as professors and university leaders, college leaders, your colleagues. Have you heard from your colleagues, even anonymously, what they thought about what you were saying about what was working and what isn't? And what was the response from that group of your readers?
There's been a big response, less so in my immediate colleagues at Columbia. Columbia has a core curriculum, and I love this curriculum. I think it's a great model for other universities to adapt to their own situations. But I pick a lot of fights in the book. It is polemical in a way. I do offer a very spirited critique of the way that academia works today, particularly in general education. So some people didn't like that. Some people have got angry at that and wrote about it. There's one very nasty review, for example, that appeared in the New Yorker. But when I remember when that happened, it was early when the book came out. My editor wrote me an email and said, "There's a review in the New Yorker coming out. It's a horrible. This person who wrote it is a terrible individual. It's despicable." And I could care less what. I got a review in the New Yorker. That just topped everything. I don't care what it says. My book is being reviewed in the New Yorker. End of story. No, but there has been a kind of bimodal response from faculty. There have also been many faculty who saw in this book a source of support and strengthening of what they were doing. That is, there were many faculty that I have encountered who are trying to revive and keep alive this idea of liberal education in their own campuses, and for whom this book was ammunition, for whom this book was really an important vote of confidence and support. And so I've met a lot of them have traveled and continue to travel all over the country, speaking at schools and often meeting with curricular committees and people who are thinking about how to reorganize general education. The critics have been, frankly, fewer than I thought. I mentioned that one very notable attack on the book, but for the most part, people who disagree have stayed silent. There has not been most of the overwhelming response has been positive. People who have spoken about the book have spoken about it positively rather than negatively. And I think that's because the arguments I make are so irrefutable that people who disagree just stay quiet. Yeah.
So I know we are going to open it up to the audience for questions. I have one last question. So when all of these wonderful people go and buy the book in the hallway and read it on their own, what is...
You don't have to read it tonight. You can take a few days to read it.
It is really, I have to say, the way you laid it out is wonderful.
Thank you.
There's a lot of kind of stopping points, so if you are doing a few minutes and set it down, and in this busy world, that was very helpful. What's one idea or main point that you would want the readers to hold on to and come away with from reading your book? What would that be for you that they walked away with?
The idea that self-exploration under the provocation of great works of art is one of the highest, maybe the highest form of human fulfillment. That is that this capacity and this opportunity that we have of using great works of art as a way to attain deeper self-understanding is just such a privilege and such a...
All right, everybody, that's your homework. And so we're going to come around with microphones.
Good evening. Thank you very much for a really enjoyable time. I want to take your classes. So you talked about the great books of the Western tradition, mentioned Gandhi, and yet largely through the lens of his contact with the Western tradition. I'm wondering, same question that Ben asked, but with a little bit different context. If you had another author on the bubble who was not part of the Western tradition, from the great books of China or India or other cultures that would be very different from our own?
So my formal education is so deeply education has been very, very focused on non-Western classics. So I've never taken a class, but I've read a lot of, and it's really meaningful to me, in some ways personally meaningful to me, in a way that the Western classics are not. And in part because so much of the classical, I'm thinking South, sort of Chinese, Japanese, and Indian traditions in classical literature are sort of spiritually oriented, ethically oriented, which I have a natural affinity for. But if I had to single out a writer, and it's more like a tradition of writing from non-Western ancient sources, it would be clearly the writings that are collected in what's something called the Pali canon, which are the writings, the most ancient writings of the teachings of the Buddha. Gautama, the name of the historical person that then attained enlightenment and became the Buddha, he didn't write anything down. It's not clear that he was even literate. But his teachings were preserved in oral tradition. And a couple of 100 years after the death of the Buddha, they were written down. The same oral tradition that had been very, if you read them, you can see they're very formulaic and very repetitive. You can see that they are delivered in a form that is very stable orally. But anyway, those writings get written down a couple of 100 years after the Buddha's death in the Pali language, one of the earliest writings in that language. And it's a big collection of the Buddha's teachings, but it's an extraordinary, whether you have an interest in Buddhism or in sort of the Buddhism as a sort of existential, ethical, religious practice or not, just if you're interested in the human condition, is an extraordinary collection of reflections and insights into the nature of human experience. So the Pali Canon, it's big, but it's so extraordinarily rich. It's a single source. Like if I was stranded in an island, right, and I could take one thing, that would be the thing I take. It would be the collection from the Pali Canon. Yeah.
So as we think about the enrollment cliff that we are expecting in higher education and the declining enrollments at the smaller institutions across the country, beyond offering this book to presidents and provosts and academians, what can we do to encourage the humanities as part of that education and the concepts that we expect people to take in the educational realm, since we're so focused on large public?
Yeah, great question. I think about this a lot. We are facing two enrollment cliffs. One is in the humanities. The number of students majoring in the humanities, particularly in the traditional humanities disciplines, English, history, philosophy, classics, fell off a cliff, and it continues to fall off a cliff. So that's one enrollment cliff. The other one is not just in the humanities, it's just the number of college students, right? The number of people who are going to college, and that has two aspects to it. One is just demographic. We reached a peak in population-wise of college-age students, and that population is now beginning a decline. And there are fewer of those who are choosing to go to college. That is, colleges have gained for themselves a bad reputation, in many cases deserved bad reputation, but also the way that the economy and the marketplace is changing, it's made a college degree less essential. And of course, the price of college makes it less economically viable. Anyway, so there's an enrollment decline happening in that. The question of how do we get students to study the humanities, I think is really, it's the one that I concern myself most about. The question about the demographic decline, I mean, we can think about how to improve our fertility rates, and not quite my area, although I have 2 children. And questions of college affordability, those are, I do think about those more, and I think now the bottom line there is that we need to make greater social investments in higher education. That's just bottom line. We have to do that. There are certain goods that are social goods, and where the community as a whole benefits from our investment, like the creation of a library. How do we get students into the humanities? I think that the model used to be you try to get people to major in the humanities, and I think that is exhausted, that model, and that should not be our focus. Our idea should not be that the way that students are going to study the humanities and the way that we're going to keep the humanities alive in college is by getting more majors into the humanities. I think what we have to do is focus on what's called general education. That is, it is this sort of lane in the curriculum, this set of courses that are often in the humanities, but that everybody has to take regardless of their major. If you're going to be a math major or a biology major or a business major, there's still these courses that you take. That's what we need to put our attention, because the fact is that a liberal education is not for the liberal arts major. A liberal education is for everybody, right? So this idea that, in fact, a liberal arts major is an oxymoron. Liberal arts major is like specializing in general education. You can't specialize in general education. Liberal education is really the thing that everybody should have in common, regardless of what specialization they're going to. So that's what we need to put our attention in, creating curricula and programs of general education in which people have a truly transformative, rigorous liberal arts experience. And most universities don't do that. In most universities, the general education curriculum is a joke, just completely inadequate and sort of a ragtag, random assemblage of things that departments want to do. Yeah.
Hi, I have just a question for our speaker and also a challenge to our librarians.
Thank you.
Maybe this will tie it together. So I was lucky enough to have quite a rigorous great books education as an undergraduate, and then went to professional school for public health, and I feel the ethics and the thoughtfulness of my liberal arts education was a great basis for statistics and biostatistics and epidemiology and so on. So I'm a really big fan of sort of combining liberal arts with professional education. But my question is, there is no way that I got enough great books as an undergraduate. And I'm here with someone from my book group, and I'm here with someone whose talks I have attended here at this library. I feel like this can't be an undergraduate challenge. This can't be a 4-year issue. You can't stop reading great books. But some of the things that I want to read now, I'm interested in Marx because one of my daughters is reading Marx in college. I cannot read Karl Marx by myself. I just don't think I have the capacity to really understand it. And I do feel
He's not
that
a particularly good writer.
I know. And it's very dense and the books are long. So I do tend to default to fiction, and my writing is at a lighter level than I feel that it could be. I do feel that there is a need for sort of a deeper adult education, and I feel that libraries are filling that in, book groups are filling that in. You know, there's all kinds of channels that we are learning as adults, but I would love to hear your thoughts about, you know, lifelong learning and how we can engage with those great books from multiple different cultures and eras after we graduate with an undergraduate degree.
Yeah, great.
You put the program together, we'll run it.
It's a curious thing that while the humanities are in crisis in the university, they are thriving outside the university. In places like this, in theaters, in museums, in reading groups. The stuff that's being produced creatively and the ways that people are coming together to pursue fundamentally humanist education is exploding outside of the university. So that's a curious thing. And that is, in some ways, I always say that okay, so certainly the point of reading great books as an undergraduate is not to finish that education, it's to start that education. Right, we need to make sure that people get started with that, and since we have a captive audience in college, and because students are at the traditional college student is in that pivotal moment between childhood and adulthood, where they are sorting out their own lives and organizing their own worldview. That's such a fertile place in which to plant the great books and have these conversations. But that is only the beginning. I believe very strongly that liberal education is something that happens from person to person, not something that happens from book to person. That is, you can't really get a liberal education just by sitting in a room alone reading. You have to engage other people about that reading and about your reactions to that reading and their reactions to that reading, and sort of process and digest, metabolize the material in conversation, in dialogue. That's what does the liberal education. So reading groups, whether organized in libraries or whether organized individually, there are various online reading communities. There's one that I know of that's specific about great books called the Catherine Project, and it's free. People just go online and you sign up for a course. There are different models, a 12-week course or a shorter course. And you read great books with others online, which is not as good as in person, but still the conversation aspect is there and you actually get more done than you might imagine you do. But places like this, right? I was telling Ben when we were in the car that libraries are a critical element of the civic infrastructure, of the connective tissue that we need to revitalize for the sake of our democracy. The fabric of our democracy is fraying. There is a kind of profound political dysfunction in our society that one of whose primary roots is in education, is in our citizenry not getting and not having gotten a liberal education, the kind of education that prepares you for deliberation in a democratic society, for self-governance. So libraries and institutions like this are critical to the project of revitalizing the civic connective tissue, the civic infrastructure that is absolutely required for us to survive as a democracy. Yeah.
I would just add, from a programming standpoint, I think we know people like to come together to be entertained, and we try to offer a lot of programming so that people can come and learn together. And I think that is something that libraries certainly can do. And we can offer the program. You guys can require them.
Right.
People can self-elect to go. And so I think if collectively working on that coming together to learn and being open to honest conversation, not thinking, we talked about, read a book and make up your own mind, as opposed to having it being given to you what you should think, which is easier, I suppose. And so I think that is something that we will continue to try to do, is to create coming together to learn and ask questions of experts and so forth.
Yeah, and the college setting, I just want a little footnote that it cuts both ways. It's great because you have a captive audience. You can require that they do it. On the other hand, I find that having to give grades is the biggest counterproductive thing in my classroom. That is, it undermines what I'm trying to do. It is so destructive to the thing that I'm trying to do, the fact that I have to give students a grade at the end of the semester. So it cuts both ways.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
We have maybe time for one more question.
So I know your book is aimed at the colleges themselves, and changing the way that they do things. But
It's one of the targets.
One of the topics,
right?
But as a parent who cannot tell my children what to do you have any tips for how to help raise kids who want to go and get that type of education rather than looking for the cheapest option that's going to get them into the workforce the fastest? Because I feel like that's the way colleges seem to them now, whereas it was a different experience for maybe our generation.
I think about this a lot because I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old. So I'm still some ways before having to choose a college. But I think about that a lot. How do I encourage, nourish the kind of curiosity, the kind of openness, the kind of wide lens that will make my kids want to have a liberal education, right? How do I do that? And there are a couple of things that I know are sort of on the right track. So one is to give them a very rich and stimulating environment, rich in precisely the things that ideas, dialogue, art, creativity, investigation, experimentation. Sometimes I feel like I am, especially my 6-year-old, I feel like I am a slave to his curiosities. Like one of my full-time jobs is to just respond to Arjuna's curiosities constantly, and feed them, encourage them. So this is what liberal education looks like. Liberal education has to happen along the entire spectrum of education. It's not a higher education thing. And the way that liberal education looks like for my 2.5-year-old, it's different than it looks like for my 6-year-old. And I'm constantly trying to figure out, but I'm doing it intentionally, right? I am actually giving it thought and putting energy and care into that project. I hope I'm on the right track. It sounds like your children are older than mine. No, they're not. Okay, Annie over here has an 11 and a 9, so she probably can speak more knowledgeably about the age group that you're in. But the bottom line is to surround them with the kind of rich, curious stimulation, the kinds of dinner conversations, the kinds of bringing them into consideration of issues in the world that matter to you, right, as well. I think that's one way to start, one direction in which to start.
Well, I want to thank you for surrounding us with curious and stimulating conversation here tonight. I think Roosevelt is going to sign books for those who have them. We have them for sale outside, and thanks to the Book Loft. I think we may whisk you away upstairs so that people can go right up those stairs and meet you.
I will follow you.
Perfect. That sounds great. Okay. I want to just say thank you all for coming. Our next big event is the Summer Community Read Kickoff Party. That's May 30th at 3 p.m. And then our next author visit is Hanif Abdurraqib with Franny Choi, June 6th at 7 p.m. Please grab a Centennial brochure. We have so much great stuff. And thank you so much, Roosevelt.
Thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure. Thank you.